lot of you have been asking for stories that pick up where the old ones left off, real updates from real people whose lives didn't just stop when the horror did. So, if you haven't already, subscribe right now because what you're about to hear isn't just an update. It's a full-blown unraveling of something that was never meant to be found again. This is the continuation of the lagoon story, the one with the beach house, the 4 silhouettes, the stolen boat, and the sounds of someone swimming through the dark. If you remember that one, you'll know why this story still haunts me, and why even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something about that night was never over. What I'm about to tell you didn't happen to me directly, but I was there for what came after. It started with a phone call, one that came out of nowhere, from Charles. We hadn't talked much since that high school reunion, but when his name popped up on my screen one random Tuesday night, I had this weird sinking feeling that it wasn't just to catch up. I answered, and right away I could hear the panic in his voice. It wasn't small talk, he just said, "You remember the boat?" I froze. I hadn't thought about that night in months, maybe even a year, but hearing him bring it up made my heart race like it did back then. I asked him what was wrong, and all he said was, "You need to come down here, please." I drove to Long Beach Island that same night, arriving just before dawn. Charles's family had sold their old beach house a few years back, but he still lived in the area. He met me outside his parents' new place, a smaller, more modern home on the bayside. I'll never forget how he looked that morning, pale, tired, with this nervous energy that made me realize he hadn't slept all night. When I got out of the car, he didn't say a word at first. He just motioned for me to follow him down to the dock behind the house. The water was calm, a silver sheet reflecting the first bits of sunrise. And there, tied up at the end of the dock, was a boat. Not just any boat. It was the boat. The same one from that night years ago, the same Boston Ware that had vanished with the thieves. It looked exactly like I remembered it, except for one difference. Its name had been painted over. The original name, Windbreaker, was gone, replaced by sloppy white letters that read, Second Wind. The paint job looked amateurish, like someone had done it recently, and in a hurry. I stared at it for what felt like forever before I managed to ask him where it came from. Charles said his dad found it drifting near the marshes 2 nights ago, half submerged, tangled in reeds. The Coast Guard had been called, but when they came, they said there was no record of the boat's registration anymore. The serial number plate had been removed and the ving scratched out. They towed it back to shore anyway, assuming it was just abandoned. But Charles said something about it wasn't right. There were scratches all along the hull, long, deep ones that didn't look like normal wear or from rocks. They looked deliberate, almost like someone had dragged metal claws across it. And then there was the smell. Charles said it reeked not like fish or seawater, but something sour, chemical, and rotten all at once. He said his dad was planning to call a salvage yard to haul it away that day. But before they could, Charles found something in the storage compartment under the steering console. He reached down to the dock and pulled up a small plastic bag from beside the boat, sealed with duct tape. Inside was a phone, an old waterproof one, maybe a decade out of date, covered in salt and grime. It was wedged behind the wiring, he said. I almost didn't see it. He said he charged it overnight and it somehow still worked enough to turn on. I asked him what was on it. He looked at me and said quietly, "Videos." Then he handed it to me. The person, or whatever it was, stood there for 2 seconds before walking out of frame. That was it. No other files. No explanation. Charles said he didn't tell his parents yet. He didn't even show them the videos. I didn't want to scare them again, he said. But someone needs to know. I told him we needed to go to the police right away, but he just shook his head. They won't believe us, he said. They didn't last time. He wanted to see the spot where the boat had been found before deciding what to do. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go with him. We took his dad's truck out to the marshes around mid-morning. It was about 20 minutes north of the house, near a stretch of the bay called Oyster Cut. The Coast Guard had marked the location with a small orange buoy, but the area itself was desolate, just endless grass, shallow water, and silence. When we got out of the truck, the smell hit immediately. That same sour, rotting odor Charles mentioned. We followed the tire marks down the narrow dirt road until we reached the water's edge. There were drag marks in the mud where the boat had been pulled out. I noticed something odd embedded in the mud near the edge was a trail of deep footprints. They weren't from boots. They were bare, large, and uneven, like whoever made them had been limping or dragging one leg. They led from the waterline into the tall reeds and then disappeared. Charles wanted to follow them, but I hesitated. Everything in my body screamed that we shouldn't, but he was already moving ahead, pushing through the brush. I didn't want to leave him alone, so I followed. The air was heavy, the kind that sticks to your skin, and the smell only got stronger. After maybe 100 feet, we found a small clearing in the reeds where the ground dipped slightly. There, half buried in mud, was something wrapped in a tarp. Charles crouched down and pulled at one corner. I told him not to, but he didn't listen. The moment he peeled it back, both of us recoiled. Inside the tarp was a pile of old clothes, soaked and stiff with dried salt. But that wasn't what made us step back. Underneath the clothes was a human arm. Swollen, pale, the fingers curled like claws. Charles stumbled back, gagging, while I froze in place. The smell was unbearable now. I could barely think. Charles said, We have to call the police." We ran back to the truck, not even bothering to look behind us. We called the police from the truck, hands shaking, still covered in mud. They told us to stay where we were and wait for an officer to arrive. It took nearly 40 minutes, but it felt like hours sitting there in silence with the engine running, watching the reeds sway in the wind. Every sound, the splash of water, the creak of the truck made both of us jump. When the 2 patrol cars finally showed up, the first officer, a middle-aged man with sunburned cheeks, immediately told us to back away from the area and led us toward the road while the others taped it off. I could see their faces change when they lifted the tarp. Within minutes, more vehicles arrived, county detectives, a coroner's van, even someone from the Coast Guard again. Charles and I were separated for questioning, each of us repeating the same story about finding the boat, the bag, and then following the tracks. They kept us there for hours, until well past sunset, before finally letting us go. One detective, a woman named Lang, took my statement last. She was calm, measured, but I could tell she didn't know what to make of it either. When I mentioned the phone and the videos, she paused and asked if we still had it. I told her yes, that Charles had it with him. She asked to keep it as evidence, and Charles reluctantly handed it over. Before we left, she told us not to talk about what we'd seen publicly said it could compromise an ongoing investigation. I asked her if she thought the remains could be connected to the old break-in, but she didn't answer. She just said, "We'll be in touch." That night, Charles insisted I stay over. His parents were out of town, and the idea of either of us being alone felt unbearable. We crashed in the living room, but neither of us slept. Around 2 a.m., I got up to grab some water, and that's when I noticed something strange outside. From the kitchen window, I could see the boat still tied up at the dock. But it was moving, gently at first, like it was just a tide, but then it tugged hard. Like something underwater had pulled it. I went closer, pressing my face to the glass. The rope was straining against the cleat, the water rippling unnaturally. Then, slowly, it stopped. Everything went still again. I stood there frozen, staring out into the blackness beyond the dock, when I saw it, a light, faint and distant, flickering between the reeds across the lagoon. It looked like a lantern or flashlight swaying side to side. Then another, 2 of them. I backed away from the window and woke Charles up. When he saw the lights, his face drained of color. "That's the marsh," he said quietly. "That's where we found it." We debated calling the police again, but before either of us could, the lights blinked out. Just gone. Vanished. We stayed up until dawn with every light in the house on, but nothing else happened that night. The next morning, Charles got a call from Detective Lan. She wanted to meet us at the station. When we got there, she looked exhausted. She told us they had confirmed the remains were human but badly decomposed. Too damaged to identify quickly. However, there was something else. She said they found a second tarp about 10 feet away from the first, but it had been torn open empty except for traces of blood and seaweed. "We think animals might have dragged something out of it," she said. I asked if the phone videos helped. She hesitated, then said they were still being processed, but that the metadata didn't match the file dates. They were older. Way older, as in before 2024. That didn't make sense. When we left the station, Charles was silent the whole drive home. Once we got there, he turned to me and said, "I think we need to go back to the old house." I thought he was joking. That place had been sold years ago. But he wasn't talking about going inside, he meant the lagoon. "That's where it started," he said. "And I don't think it's over." I wanted to tell him it was insane, but deep down, I agreed. There was something about all of this that didn't feel finished. Against every instinct, I told him I'd go with him that evening. We arrived just before sunset. The new owners of the house weren't around, which was lucky for us. As he leaned over, I caught a faint smell, faint but unmistakable, that same sour rot. Then came the noise. A faint, steady tapping sound, like something hitting the underside of the dock. Tap, tap. Charles froze and looked down. The sound grew louder. We both leaned over, peering into the dark water below. Nothing, just ripples. Then, out of nowhere, something bumped the dock from underneath, hard enough to make us both stumble back. Charles grabbed my arm, his breathing fast. We crouched low, and then I saw something rising slowly toward the surface. It wasn't a fish or debris. It was a plastic bag, torn and waterlogged, floating up from beneath. It drifted toward the dock and got caught on one of the posts. Inside was something dark and solid. Charles reached for it with a stick, dragging it up until it tore open. Out spilled a small bundle of fabric and a wallet. He picked it up with shaking hands, opening it carefully. Inside was a water-damaged ID card. The photo was faded, but we could still make out the name, Riley Hartman. I felt sick. Riley had moved to another state years ago. I'd seen him at that reunion, talked to him. Charles's hand was trembling so badly he almost dropped it. "That's impossible," he whispered. "He's alive." We rushed back to the truck and tried calling him, but the number went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice barely steady, telling him to call me back immediately. We drove back to Charles's house in silence. That night, neither of us slept again. Around midnight, I heard Charles whisper my name from across the living room. I turned and saw him sitting up, staring out the sliding glass doors toward the dock. "Do you hear that?" he said. I listened. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it clearly, a faint voice calling from outside. A man's voice. Distant, broken, echoing over the water. It was saying something like, "Help me." Charles stood up and grabbed a flashlight, but I told him not to go. He didn't listen. He stepped out onto the deck, shining the beam across the lagoon. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." Then another, quieter, almost identical voice like an echo overlapping it. Charles moved toward the end of the dock. I followed reluctantly. The flashlight beam flickered across the water, and for a split second we saw a figure standing waist deep in the lagoon on the opposite side. It looked human, but still too still, like a statue. Then, as the light steadied, the figure slowly lifted an arm and pointed directly at us. Charles dropped the flashlight, and everything went black. We bolted back inside, slamming the door and locking it. I grabbed my phone to call the police again, but before I could, something slammed against the glass from outside. When the sun came up, the lagoon looked calm again, almost peaceful, as if none of it had happened. Charles wouldn't speak for the first few miles of the drive. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and he kept glancing into the rearview mirror like he expected someone to be sitting in the truck bed. When we finally hit the mainland bridge, he said, barely above a whisper, "We can't tell anyone else." I wanted to argue, but after the last 2 nights I understood. Who would believe us? 2 guys claiming to see a body point at them from across a marsh. The police already thought we were spooked kids chasing ghosts. For 3 days we stayed inland with friends. Every night I'd awake to the same smell of brine and decay that seemed to cling to my clothes, even after showering. On the 4th morning, I checked my phone. There was a voicemail unknown number, timestamped at 3:12 a.m. When I played it, I nearly dropped the phone. It was a man's voice, gasping between words. "It's me. Riley, don't come back." Then a splash and static. The call ended. I showed it to Charles, and he went pale. "It's a trick," he said, but his voice cracked. We called Detective Lang. She asked us to forward it, then told us something new had turned up. Divers had gone back into the lagoon to map the bottom. They'd found a trench running from the center out toward the open sea, lined with wooden pilings like part of an old collapsed dock. Inside that trench were fragments of more tarps, a chain, and bones. Dozens. She didn't say the number, but the way her voice wavered told me enough. That night, Charles drank himself half-blind. Around midnight, he said he was going back to the lagoon alone, that if Riley was alive or something was pretending to be him, he needed to know. I tried stopping him, but he grabbed his keys and left. I followed in my own car 15 minutes later, headlights off as I crossed the causeway. The closer I got, the thicker the fog grew, swallowing the guardrails, the water, everything. By the time I reached the driveway of the old house, I could barely see beyond the hood. Charles's truck was there, door open, engine still idling. I called his name, no answer. The dock lights, which should have been dead years ago, were glowing faintly underwater, shimmering through the mist. I crept down the path, heart hammering. The tide was unusually high, licking the planks. "Charles," I shouted again. Then I saw him standing at the end of the dock, back turned, staring into the lagoon. I ran up and grabbed his shoulder. He didn't move. His clothes were soaked, hair dripping. "Where have you been?" I said. Slowly, he turned his head. His eyes were open, but there was no focus in them, like he was looking through me. He whispered something I could barely hear. "He's still down there." Then he stepped forward into the water before I could grab him. I dove after him, the cold shocking my lungs, the taste of salt and rot filling my mouth. I felt his shirt sleeve for a moment, then a current yanked him deeper. I went under, groping through black water. Shapes moved around me, too many to count. Pale arms reaching, drifting hair like seaweed. I surfaced, gasping, and hauled myself onto the dock, screaming his name again and again. But the lagoon had gone still. When the police came hours later, they found no sign of Charles. No footprints, no body, nothing but his truck still idling. They drained part of the lagoon over the following week. The report said the ground beneath it collapsed inward, revealing the remains of what used to be a workers' camp from the 1930s. A hurricane had buried it under silt. The coroner matched some of the bones to old missing person cases, but not all. Riley's wallet, the tarps, even the phone were logged as evidence lost in storage. Detective Lang called once to say she was being transferred out of county and that the case would stay open pending further discovery. I moved 2 states away soon after. Sometimes I dream of water creeping under my door, of someone whispering my name through the static of an unseen phone. Every October the smell returns, the same metallic salt mixed with something foul. Last week I got a text from an unknown number, a single picture. It showed Charles standing on the dock again, waist deep in water, eyes black, hand raised in a point toward the camera. The timestamp said tomorrow, 2:14 a.m. If this video somehow reaches you, and you ever find yourself near a quiet beach with a lagoon behind it, no matter how calm it looks, don't go near the water. And if you hear someone calling for help after midnight, don't answer. It's never the living who call. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest, because the lagoon isn't finished yet, and neither am I after the photo message. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with every light off, phone on the table, waiting for it to ring. It never did, but just before dawn I heard the pipes hum inside the walls like water running where it shouldn't be. When I checked the kitchen sink, the tap was dry, but the drain gurgled saltwater smell pushing up from below. I told myself it was just plumbing. I told myself a lot of things. 3 days later, Detective Lang called from a number I didn't recognize. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't slept either. She said she found something in the archive case files that didn't belong. An old black and white photograph dated 1934, labeled Lagoon Work Site, Closure. In the picture, a line of men stood waist-deep in the same water, building what looked like a seawall. Every face was blurred except one at the far end, a man with hollow eyes, thin grin, and the same crooked nose as Charles. Lang said she'd run a facial match test just out of curiosity. The software came back with an 87% match to Charles Hemley, born 1999. That night I drove back to the coast. The road to the lagoon was barricaded with county fencing, but someone had cut the padlock. I walked down the old path with a flashlight, wind snapping through cattails. Where the dock used to be, there was now a crater filled with shallow water, glowing faintly blue. At the center, half buried in mud, stood the same wooden pilings from the photograph. The light from my phone flickered, then died. I heard voices, not one, but many, chanting low beneath the surface, like air bubbling through reeds. I stepped closer until the mud sucked at my shoes. A pale hand broke the water, then another. Dozens of them, reaching upward, fingers slick with algae. And among them rose Charles, eyes open, skin gray, his mouth moving in perfect rhythm with the others. He whispered, "It needs another." I stumbled backward, tripping over a rusted chain half buried in the dirt. Something caught my ankle cold, wet and pulled. I clawed at the ground until the chain snapped loose. When I looked again, the lagoon was calm, reflecting nothing but the overcast sky. I left that place and never went back. But sometimes I still hear water under the floorboards. And sometimes my phone vibrates with that same photograph, only each time one more figure in it looks up at the camera. If you ever see that lagoon, if you ever find a wallet washed ashore with a name you know, walk away. Because once the water remembers you, it never lets go. And that's the last thing I'll ever say about it. That night, after leaving the reunion, the rain had already begun to fall thin, needling drops that glittered in the parking lot lights like shavings of glass, and I remember thinking that everything Charles had said about his brother, a trip to the island, kept looping in my mind, like a song that wouldn't end. He'd told me that story with a shaky laugh, but there was something behind his eyes, something brittle, like he was barely holding it together. I could still hear the way he said the word shovel, almost spitting it out, as if the syllables themselves carried a bad taste. I got into my car, the windows fogged immediately, and before I even started the engine, I opened my phone and recorded a voice memo, saying out loud what I'd just heard so I wouldn't forget the details later. That's what started all of this again, the need to remember, because memories, I've learned, don't just fade. Sometimes they rot, and when they rot, they spread into places they were never meant to reach. I didn't know it then, but that night would be the last normal night I ever had. If you're new here, or if you've stumbled on this by accident, make sure you subscribe so you can hear what really happens when you try to reopen a story that should have stayed buried. Because I promise you, this isn't the kind of thing you want to hear alone in the dark. The drive home was quiet except for the steady tap of rain. That should have been enough for me to drop it, but the human brain doesn't handle unfinished things very well. By the time I reached home, the power had flickered twice, and the sound of rain on the windows somehow mimicked the pulse of the ocean, like the lagoon was inside the walls. I lay awake replaying everything, the original break-in, the shadows crossing the water, the missing boat, and now this new message. The idea that something could come back after being gone that long, that it could still matter, felt impossible. Yet I couldn't shake the image of the man on the island running with that shovel, his silhouette framed in moonlight, the sound of wet sand under his boots. At around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and opened my laptop. Out of pure morbid curiosity, I started searching old local news archives for any mention of stolen boats, missing persons, drownings, anything that might connect. Most results were dead ends, but buried in an old forum for boat enthusiasts, the first found a post from 2021 by a user named Saltwido. It mentioned hearing strange low-frequency hums near Carl Island late at night, sometimes followed by faint lights moving underwater. The replies were mostly jokes about aliens, but one person wrote that the hums were real, that they recorded them using hydrophones near the wildlife refuge, and they stopped when a storm hit that same week. Something about the description, the hum like an idling engine under the waves, made my stomach twist. I could almost hear it, The next day I texted Charles. He didn't answer for hours. When he finally called, his voice sounded exhausted, like he hadn't slept either. "Bro, don't mention that island," he said before I even greeted him. "You'll make it worse." That phrasing startled me. Make it worse, as if acknowledging it gave it strength. I asked if he talked to Kieran recently, and he said no, that his brother had gone off the radar after the incident. Apparently their parents thought he was doing fine at community college somewhere inland, but Charles had a feeling he wasn't. He said he'd gotten one weird voicemail from him a few weeks back, just wind, creaking wood, and something that might have been waves slapping metal. That's when I decided to go back to Long Beach Island myself. I told no one where I was going. Part of me wanted to prove that nothing supernatural was happening, that the mind fills in darkness with monsters because it can to stand not knowing. Another part of me, the part that still wakes up sweating at the sound of splashing water, just wanted closure. When I reached LBI the next evening, the weather had turned strange. The tide was higher than normal, the sky the color of old bruise. The lagoon looked darker than I remembered, like the water was thicker, almost oily. I parked near the same row of houses we'd stayed in years ago. Charles's old beach house stood silent, shutters rattling, for sale sign half tilted in the sand. Through the windows I could see faint reflections of the water pulsing like a heartbeat. I swear for a moment I thought I saw someone standing on the opposite dock again, a tall silhouette, unmoving, but when I blinked it was gone. I walked toward the dock anyway, each step sinking deeper into the wet planks. The smell of salt and algae sharpened my throat. The sound came before the sight, a low rhythmic thrum from beneath the water, like an engine running somewhere deep below. It vibrated through the boards, through my shoes, straight into my bones. When I leaned over the railing, bubbles surfaced, not random ones, but in a perfect circular pattern, like something mechanical was breathing down there. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. A soft plop echoed from behind me. I turned, and floating at the edge of the dock was a small wooden box, about the size of a jewelry case. It must have drifted in, but it was sealed tight with a rusted clasp. My curiosity got the better of me. I pulled it out. It was surprisingly heavy, cold to the touch. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. Water damaged, but still visible. 3 teenagers standing on a familiar beach, me, Charles, and Riley from that same summer all those years ago. But the thing that made my skin crawl was that a 4th shadow appeared behind us in the picture. Long and distorted, its head bent at an impossible angle. None of us had ever noticed it before because, well, that photo had never existed until now. That was the first sign that something far larger than memory was at play.